Hello and welcome to World Talks here on TVP World with me, Ashim Kumar. Tonight we turn to the latest escalation in Ukraine. Russia has launched one of its largest overnight attacks since the invasion began, striking Kyiv with drones, missiles and ballistic weapons. At the same time, Washington is equipping Ukraine with deeper strike capabilities, while Donald Trump imposes massive tariffs on India, citing trade with Russia. With negotiations in Alaska stalled, we ask, are those attacks a message to Trump? Well, joining us is US national security analyst Mark Toth. Mark, welcome back and good to see you.
Ashim, always good to see you and a chance to talk to your viewers. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. So let's start. I mean, the strikes seem to be getting worse. The civilians keep on dying. Civilian targets are being hit all the time. Is there a message, or is it just a random, uncontrolled barbarism?
Yeah, Ashim, it is a message. It's the same message, frankly. If I recollect correctly, you were the first 3 years ago to interview me on TVP World. And Putin has been sending the same message ever since, that he intends to complete his war aims in Ukraine. And that doesn't mean just eastern Ukraine, but all of Ukraine at some point. And so whether you're having the Alaska summit or you're having Trump try to get negotiations happening on a bilateral or trilateral basis between Trump himself and Zelensky and Putin, it's the same message, and this is messaging. And as I've often said here on TVP World, you really have to look to Putin's actions to see what he's trying to do. And his actions right now say he's not interested in peace. He's continuing to commit war crimes by intentionally attacking Ukrainian civilians in Kyiv and Lviv. And that's the answer. This is complete messaging. War as it's always been.
Right. So I want to talk about the negotiations with Trump in just a second. But amongst those buildings that were attacked in Ukraine include an EU building, a United Kingdom official building, and buildings representing other countries. Is Putin saying to these other countries, well, we don't care. I don't care about your solidarity with Ukraine. You're in the crosshairs just as much as Ukraine is.
Right. It's highly likely, a shame, and it's good for you to point that out. It's highly likely that it was intentional. But even if it wasn't, even if it was a stray missile that got away from them, nonetheless, they've not backed off of it. There's been no formal apologies for hitting the EU. So whether it was a messaging act by design or now a messaging, after the effect, if you will, that's what it's serving as. It's basically telling the EU, we're unaffected by you. I, as Putin, am going to continue to do our campaign against Ukraine, and anything that you do is not going to stop us. And I think if Europe doesn't send a strong message back, if there's not immediate consequences for those offices being hit, then Putin's going to believe that he can get away with more. And the next attack would be intentional. And they may start doing that not just in Kyiv, but potentially elsewhere in Europe. I mean, this is not just a one-domain conflict between Moscow and the Brussels and European Union. So I think we're at a critical junction here. I think it's important that Brussels react over this and do so strongly. This has to go beyond just talk. There has to be palpable, measurable type actions taken against Putin, be it against the shadow fleet, be it freeing up those assets, as you reported on at the top of the hour, that are Russian and being held by the EU. All of those things need to happen now, not later, because Putin has sent a message, and now it's time for Brussels to send one back.
Right. Okay. So let's talk about the European response. Let's start with the shadow fleet. I mean, everyone knows which ships comprise the shadow fleet. Why are they still being allowed to sail and sell Russian oil around the world?
Right. My best estimate is because Europe is still, despite making great strides since the beginning of the war, much of it is still dependent upon the flow of Russian gas and energy supplies, so be it gas and liquefied gas and oil. And so from that standpoint, I think maybe there's some hesitancy there that if they try to shut it down in terms of the shadow fleet, it may impact some of those oil flows coming in. But Putin's desperate for revenues, and those are a key factor of it. And they could be easily shut down. Most of that shadow fleet does transit through the Baltic Sea, and that's now become a NATO lake. I mean, that's something that could be very easily shut off by NATO forces in there, and basically Putin couldn't stop it. It's not anything that he could do about it, sort of a kinetic kind of conflict. So, I think that's why we're continuing to see it. But I think we're at a juncture now where Europe is going to have to bite the bullet, even though we're facing winter in a few months, is to say we can't allow Putin to continue financing this war, either with shadow fleet revenues or with our own, where we purchase these oil and energy type assets from Russia.
Right, so it's about time to do something about the shadow fleet. Now, I also, of course, mentioned the frozen assets, 210 billion euros of Russian frozen assets. Clearly, the debate has been raging, ever since the war started. There must be a way of using that money to compensate Ukraine. I mean, Kaja Kallas said that it would be impossible to imagine the money being returned to Russia unless they'd paid reparations. What's holding it up? Who are the main protagonists here?
Yeah, I think it's probably, you might have it, Trump on the one side basically saying, let's not irritate Putin, let's not get him to move away from the negotiating table, that once those assets are released, it's irreversible. That could be one factor. It could be Europe itself. Leaders are very good about saying one thing in public, but then fearing quite another in private. And they may feel that they might lose some leverage. So that, in other words, holding these assets has become a leverage point. The problem is Putin doesn't seem very convinced that it is a leverage point with him. We're not seeing any change in his actions by what Europe does or doesn't do with respect to these funds. And so I think we are at a point where Europe needs to move the ball. They need to release these, whether it's for the long-term rebuilding of Ukraine or whether it's for the short-term or some in-between calculus of getting Ukraine more weapon systems, just as you mentioned, more defensive assets, air assets in Kyiv itself to protect against these heinous attacks on civilian sites and so forth. There's a lot that can be done with those monies.
Yes, I think Putin may be hoping that the money stays frozen until the end of the war, and then he takes the EU to court and gets his money back eventually, because he knows that the EU will abide by international law. Now, I'd like to talk about Trump's role in these negotiations. Now, clearly, since their meeting in Alaska, Trump's and Putin's, things have actually got from bad to worse. I mean, you said earlier about Putin sending a message to Trump. Do you think he's receiving this message loud and clear?
At this point, it's hard to tell if either man is receiving the messages. I think, again, if we look to the actions, it's very clear, and I need to credit the Institute for the Study of War for this, but if we look at what's happened ever since Alaska, it's clear that the Russians used the summit in order to ramp up their offensive, which is going to be part of a bigger offensive, most likely, in the fall of 2025. They started infiltration efforts around Dobrylia in terms of moving behind enemy lines. They stockpiled all of the weapons and ballistic missiles that we just saw get launched against Kyiv and Lviv and so forth. So they use that summit, in reality, is simply a green light for them to continue and go forward. Now, that may not be what Trump intended, but that's in effect what happened. And I think part of the problem that we're seeing here is that Trump has an almost Pollyanna view of how Putin is interpreting his actions. Trump wants to bypass some steps that are needed. And one of those mainly is to change the cost calculus, something that my writing partner and I, John Sweet, wrote about recently in The Hill, is that he's got to change Putin's cost calculus. At this point, Putin's willing to pay the price. He's paid nearly a million, up to maybe 1.1 million casualties, dead and wounded, and he's willing to continue down that path. So he hasn't met the point where he's willing to walk away from this from a cost standpoint. And that needs to be happening on multiple levels. You already talked about it, the releasing of the funds in Europe, more deep strike weapon capabilities for Ukraine, more combined arm warfare type things that can ultimately let Ukraine start to maneuver on the battlefield. There's a lot more that can be done. But until that happens, as long as Trump continues this Pollyanna approach to thinking that Putin's somehow going to cave, I don't think we're going to go anywhere except we're going to continue to see Putin wage this war and abate it. And by the way, just as a quick add to that, we don't have to take my assessment as an analyst on that. All we have to do is listen to the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov. He said as much. Russia's war aims remain unchanged. Let's listen to him.
Yeah, absolutely. When they talk like that, you should listen. Now, Trump has imposed 50% tariffs on India. Can these be seen as secondary sanctions, or are they completely separate?
Yeah, Shane, good question, and I think there's some confusion sometimes with readers and viewers over this. Secondary sanctions are ones that would affect the actual financial transactions that happen around the world, and those are more deadly in impact, and that's what needs to be happening. The U.S. Senate has approved that. It's a tool that's waiting for Trump to use if he so chooses, but that's not yet happened. Tariffs are different. Tariffs are basically something that the host country, and in this case, the U.S., would pay. So it would be U.S. consumers paying the price for those 50% tariffs. And obviously, the intended hope, if you're Trump, is that it would cause U.S. consumers not to purchase in India, and on the flip side would be hurt economically by it. But the two are very separate and distinct. I think the bigger picture here, though, is that Trump is someone that tends to go things on a bilateral basis. He looks at his relationship with himself and Putin. He looks at his relationship with himself and Xi. He looks at his relationship with himself and Kim Jong-un and Syria and North Korea. But the problem is he doesn't fully get it that all three of those states are closely aligned, and that's coming to a head on September 1st. They're all meeting in Beijing. Xi Jinping's leading that, and Trump's missing that. They're allied, and Trump's not leading a unified effort back. And I think that's a big problem and something that he needs to rectify and rectify quickly.
Yeah, I mean, how effective have the EU leaders who went to meet with President Trump been in kind of getting the message across to him? After the Alaska meeting between Putin and Trump, how effective have European leaders been? Is it starting to seep through into Trump's actions, do you think?
Shane, that's a great question, and let me qualify it before I answer. The European leaders accomplished the most important thing by going. They made it clear that Europe stands strong with Ukraine. So look, on that basis alone, I'm going to give them an A+. Because that was essential at the time. Because those discussions could have gone a completely opposite way. Trump could have pulled away from Ukraine, stopped intel sharing, stopped weapons supplies, et cetera. And they've done that a little bit, but not to the extent that they could have, like we saw earlier in the year after that White House meeting. So from that standpoint, well done by the European leaders. That said, I don't think they're yet having an appreciable effect on changing Trump's mind about Putin. I mean, we're still seeing reports of a post-war plan coming out of Trump that was reported in the Telegraph in London just yesterday, where Trump has these ideas of a plan that, look, when I read it, it seems fine on paper, but it's not something that Putin's likely to accept. So again, we're missing a step here. This war has to be won, or Putin has to be, have a cost imposed upon him that causes him to want to end it. And we haven't done that yet. And so we're all dancing around that, and we're looking at how post-war things look. But the war continues.
Yeah, absolutely. Mark, as always, thank you so much for your analysis and sharing it with our audience. Have a good day, sir.
Always a pleasure, Shane.
Thank you.
Especially with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye now. And that brings us to the end of this episode of World Talks. Don't go away, though. Lots more coming up. Goodbye.